Greetings, my name is BlazeLeeDragon, and I have not made a video in a while, so I figured it's about time. It's interesting, I had a comment on one of my old videos about Druidry, and it made me realize how long it's been since I worked on Walking the Druid Path videos. It's been 2 years, at least, from the time I'm making this video. So that's kind of wild. I don't know how I let that get away from me. And those of you who are interested in that, I will definitely be getting back to that. But the comment got me thinking. So the comment, it doesn't really matter who made the comment, it wasn't made in spite or anything like that. The individual had mentioned that Druidry is a modern invention, so to speak, or at least the Druidry of today is a modern invention. And obviously, if you've seen my videos before and stuff, you realize that I acknowledge that most of the paths that we have are modern inventions, or at least modern reinventions. Quite often, we refer to many of the polytheistic, whether you use the term heathen, pagan, new age, doesn't really matter which term you use. It is a revival movement, or it is a inspired by ancient stories movement, depending on how you want to look at it. So I want to talk a little bit about not only the concept of these polytheistic paths being modern revival movements or modern inventions, depending on how you want to look at it, but I also want to talk about their validity. I also want to talk about other spiritualities, and I don't mean to offend anyone, especially because many of these spiritualities are predominant today, but all spiritualities in general are essentially modern inventions. And hear me out before anyone takes up arms. So, excuse me. To begin with, I actually have a video that talks about is everything made up, is it all in our head, which is a very interesting video that kind of covers some of the points I'm going to talk about here. It's definitely worth checking out as well. So when you look at stuff like Druidry, and the reason I'm using that is because that's the most recent video comment that inspired me to do this. And I was also reading, there is an individual, and I will give a little shout out to John Beckett, who does, I think it's like pantheos.com or something like that. I probably should have had this up and actually had his website prepared. But this was another thing that kind of inspired the making of this video. Yeah, pathos.com, and I apologize if I'm mispronunciating that. So this individual, I believe they refer to themselves as a druid as well. He writes these blogs, and they're nice blogs. They're fun to read. There's also, other individuals as well who also are into modern druidry or modern revival movements. And I want to give a shout out to Lang as well. I believe that's how you pronounce her last name. And hey, I could be wrong again on this pronunciation stuff. So yeah, the comment here that struck my attention, yeah, Danny Long, or Lang, Dannilang. She also has a YouTube series as well, and really, really cool. Definitely worth checking them out. So this comment that this individual put, it's actually 17 hours ago from now. Like I said, no malintent, no problem with the comment. Druidry is a modern invention, but then all religion is an invention. Which kind of brings me once again to what I want to focus on. So let's actually get into it, because this is obviously can be potentially a long video. So when you talk about spirituality, when you talk about religion, when you talk about personal paths, when you talk about how people express themselves or seek the divine, however you want to call it by whatever name, people are going to make their own interpretations. You see this even in established religions. So let's talk about modern established religions that can trace its origin back fairly accurately to older times. Let's look at Hinduism. Let's look at Christianity. Now, the reason I'm bringing up those two is those are fairly well known. So obviously I live in the United States of America, and those are two very, very, very well known paths. There's, of course, many others as well. But Christianity itself, let's look at that first. So Christianity is fairly dominant in the United States. It's not the only religion out there, obviously, and it is not the religion that all people in the United States follow or practice, but it is very, very influential in everything from our money that says "In God We Trust" to the national holidays, which are typically associated with the Christianized version of them. I'm not trying to badmouth Christianity, so let me say that first. I'm trying to say this about any religion and every religion. Christianity has a fairly extensive background in history. However, you have all of these different denominations and versions. You have Catholics and Protestants who are very, very animate about how you should interpret and read the Bible, as an example. You have versions of the Bible. You have the King James's version, but there's all these different printings of them. And it's interesting. It's just very, very interesting to me that, again, it's supposed to be this one path as ancient history, but people are interpreting it differently. Let's look at individuals who follow it and then argue about how you follow it and take it to different extremes, like whether it's an evangelist or a Presbyterian or a Mormon or all of these different paths, yet they're all supposed to essentially be from the same root. Yet people not only interpret it differently, but they also interpret it differently based upon each of their churches, which is their gathering of individuals. Each of them will practice it slightly differently. You'll have individuals who will swear up and down that they're Christian, Catholic, whatever. It doesn't matter which denomination, yet they don't always follow or practice as they're supposed to. They don't go to their regular Sunday worship. They don't. They're not abstinent until they're married. They get divorced. I believe, at least in Catholicism, they don't believe in divorce. So I think they have this thing called annulment or something like that. But it's like, I'm not real versed on the Christian mythologies or anything like that, or their paths or practices. But it's interesting that there's such a huge variety, even today, even with the history, the way that people practice it right now today. People take it to different extremes. People use it as a weapon or a tool to fight or argue with folks, but then other folks will do it to be kind and open with each other. I have met Christians who are straight up vicious with me for not being Christian or celebrating their holidays, almost to the point of I've had people almost chase me out of jobs before for it, like treat me like shit until I quit, like made it as difficult as possible to work there. But then I've had other individuals who are straight up Christian have no problem me following a different path. They don't think I'm right. They think I'm wrong. That's fine. But they accept and embrace that. And they would still give me the shirt off their back if I was cold. These people are just that good, open. So again, this interpretation. It's also interesting because there are, and I'm not complaining, I believe each person needs to follow their own path, their own choices, whatever it is. So obviously homosexuality is a concern for many people who consider themselves to be Christian. Yet there are those who are homosexual and consider themselves Christian, and it almost seems there's an argument of whether or not it's against a religion or not. Apparently, I don't know, again, because I don't follow that religion, and I personally am not a homosexual, so I don't know in either case. But there's arguments about individuals who say you can't, you can. You can even get into those who consider themselves to be a Christian witch, or they will say that they're a Christian Wiccan or something along those lines, where they're polytheistic, but they're also Christian. So again, how can they be both? There's this interpretation, there's this involvement. So you have this evolution, not only through the years and through the times, like obviously the way that they dealt with individuals who were outside of their faith or they considered to be corrupt or evil in some fashion is dealt with differently today than it was hundreds of years ago. Obviously. Depends on the region, of course. So there's that interpretation, but there's also the interpretation of how you accurately practice and do these practices. And I wonder how much is lost through the time or ignored or just not practiced or tossed out. I wonder how much of it has been adapted. And like I said, even from person to person, from generation to generation, we see today a great difference. Now, I brought up Hinduism as well. So again, I'm not trying to focus and pick on Christianity. I'm not. It's just because it's so prevalent, especially in the United States, I thought it would be the wise, or at least maybe not wise, but it would be a great example to bring up first. Now, the next example I want to bring up is Hinduism. It's interesting because I've posted videos on Hinduism. I am not a Hindu, obviously. I don't consider myself a Hindu. I've studied Hinduism a little bit. I've researched it. My wife has done more study into it because she was very fascinated by its just general culture and its practices and things like that. And she did a lot of research. The interesting thing, as she began to research, she was completely rejected and pushed out because if you were not Indian, you couldn't be a Hindu according to some Hindus. It depends on the Hindu you talk to. Again, interpretation and evolving through it. Then online, having these different comments on these videos where I, a non Hindu, is talking about Hinduism, just talking about it, not telling people how to practice, but talking about one book that my wife had read. And we had a discussion around the interpretations of that book and how that author applied it. And we had Hindus or individuals who felt they knew about Hinduism, even if I don't know each individual person's path, straight up attacking us, and then others saying, "Oh, these people get it right." Back and forth again, completely different sides. I've had individuals who consider Hinduism to be monotheistic. There's one God, even though they have multiple gods and goddesses. There's one God. Then I've had other Hindus I've spoken with say that it's polytheistic and there's multiple gods and goddesses. Again, interpretation in modern times, today, people, individuals practicing this religion, yet there's this great variance on it. So, what is the point of all of this? I'm bringing up the point of the fact that when it comes to religion, yes, as I've said in other videos and as this individual has commented, it is all an invention of man. You can say what you want. I don't care if it's from divine inspiration. We're writing it in man's words or humankind's words, because I mean men and women. Humankind's words are being recorded. There is going to be an interpretation of those words, and it's going to hold different value to different people based upon how they interpret those words and how they choose to follow it. That's the reality of the situation. All religion, I don't care what it is, what spiritual path, what religion, it is going to be interpreted, it is going to be altered, and it's going to be pushed until it fits that person's ideal of what they feel the religion should be. Now, traditionally, religion is taught to you by your parents or your community and your society, and you're raised up in a religion. People typically don't question it. It's when individuals start to question it and seek other answers and seek other information that all hell breaks loose, so to speak. The validity of religion, I feel, is just based upon that person's individual, the person in question, who is practicing or attempting to practice or seek out that religion. That is where it becomes an important necessity to take a look and take stock of that person's experience. What are they hoping to get out of it? What are they seeking? The ultimate what's right or wrong, I hate to tell you this, but the truth and the reality of these religions that are essentially made up and invented by man, all of them, all the paths, I'm not just talking about Hinduism, Christianity, I'm talking about all paths. They're essentially created and developed by men and women in today's society, throughout history, passed down, taught, interpreted, experienced, and adapted, because that's the spiritual path. That's the path of living, experiencing life and making decisions and having your own connection. We don't have any hardcore facts or evidence, considered scientific or otherwise, to prove any of these religions or paths or history or origin on any of them. And you can argue in that with me, that's fine. You can have your own opinion. I'm not telling you you have to take mine, but come on, folks. There's no hardcore evidence that a god or goddess or great spirit exists or does not exist. There's no hardcore evidence. It is called blind faith. It is your belief. It is a feeling you have, a sensation, an interpretation that you feel. And people go and become religious or not religious or are extremely religious or barely religious all the time for all these different paths in different ways. So in my opinion, the validity of any path, whether it has a great ancient history or is brand new and has been invented today, right now, this second, doesn't matter. Ultimately, at the end of the day, if that individual is finding their spiritual growth by seeking or calling it by any name or doing any sort of practice, that is up to them. Now, the other part, let's talk about these revival movements. Are they technically revival? Because we don't really know, we as a society, as a peoples, don't really know some of the quote-unquote ancient practices, some of the quote-unquote heathen, pagan, polytheistic practices of ancient past, if it's not one of the ones that claim to still be in existence because it's lived that long. Like I said, maybe, I don't know, there's tons of religions in the world. But specifically, let's just talk about Christianity and Hinduism are examples of ones that supposedly are over 1,000 years old. I'm not saying exactly 1,000 years, but over 1,000 years plus some. They're claiming this. Okay, if there's history of it, that's fine. But just because it's that old, does it make it that much right? Back hundreds of years ago, people used to think that if you had an illness, you had to bleed it out of you. That's right, cut you and bleed out that illness. There's all sorts of different thoughts and concepts. The world was flat. Christopher Columbus was darn straight that, I know I'm in India, so these are Indians. And to this day, they call Native Americans, Aboriginal Americans, the tribes, the Sioux, the Blackfoot, Cherokee. They're calling them Indians, even though Indians are people from India because of one guy's mistake. So again, people make these assumptions and they can be wrong. So just because it's old and it's been said for years doesn't make it right or more valid than somebody who just comes up with a thought today. So during the hippie movement, the new age, the new wave stuff, these revival movements or brand new thought concepts inspired by these old paths has validity in the fact that, again, it is individuals who are trying to seek a path and interpret something today. And if they're getting something out of it, more power to them. My number one requirement in my head, in my opinion, is if you're not harming others, go for it. You follow your path, you find what's right for you. If you're connecting to the divine in some way, shape, fashion, if you were dancing around in your backyard wearing a lampshade on your head, if that's the connection, if that's what it feels right, do it. Who is these other people to tell you what is right or wrong when they themselves have no validity in their own path or religion either? A group of people, no matter how many folks, millions, tens of millions, it doesn't matter. It does not make a path more valid because more people buy into that bullshit. It is you and your experience that is most important, which is why myself, including many others, are not the biggest fan of organized religion, because organized religion tries to enforce or instill or interpret and push their interpretations. I'll consider and hear, and I advise you to do the same, but don't let other people choose your path for you. As I've said before in my other videos, don't be the bitch of somebody else's religion. Make it your own. So these new paths, let's talk about different polytheistic, heathen, pagan, and again, there's tons of them. So let's talk about a few of them. Let's talk about Druidry because it, again, inspired this video. But let's also talk about Ausatru. Let's talk about Wicca. So let's talk about those three at least. And like I said, again, many, 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 many different paths. So Wicca. Depending on who you ask, Wicca is supposed to have thousands of years as well. And if you look back, there's some etymology, root word or origin of words, that apparently Wicca, if you look back at the Anglo-Saxon, that's right, one of my videos I said Anglo-Saxon, Anglo-Saxon words, it's actually, as I understand it, pronounced Witcha and Witche. And Witcha, I believe, was like supposedly a male wise person. Witche was a female wise person or something like that. But we don't have any historical evidence that it was an organized religion around these individuals that supposedly existed, nor for how long they existed for, nor if their practices are still alive today. So the instant connection of just by using an old word, is there any connection? So it is a new age, a new revival movement, even if it's been inspired by the past. And I've had folks argue about this. If you look back at Gerald Gardner was one of the folks that at least brought Wicca into the mainstream, even if he's not the one who invented it. If you are going to claim ancient history on a path or spirituality, if you are not able to provide evidence of that path and history, it's irrelevant. You saying so doesn't make it true. So again, accept it for what it is, but what is that path looking for? What are Wiccans trying to accomplish? And if they're finding that, then let them. More power to them. Same thing goes for Ausatru. So if you look at the Nordic Scandinavian traditions, they didn't really have a name for their path. They just were. It was part of their culture and society. The Nordic people, when they traveled, they went on a Vikinger or a Viking. They went on a Viking. Vikings were folks that went on a Viking. They went on a journey. They could be trading. They could be settling. They could be scouting. they could be raiding. There's many, many, many different reasons why people would go on a Viking or a Vikinger. They didn't necessarily have their own path that was etched in stone because they got so much from different cultures. They got different clothes or different weapons or, different religions or spiritualities and did some adaptations. So, specifically with Alsatru, which is only one name for the revival movement of the Old Norse traditions, is specifically an Icelandic movement. And yes, I do have some heritage in Iceland, which is, I've mentioned in my other videos before. Alsatru has actually gotten to the point where the folks in Iceland are separating themselves from the rest of the world because of the difference of interpretation. You have individuals who are using Alsatru as a negative impact, and if you're not part of the blood, you can't practice, or if you're not of a specific heritage or bloodline, then they're superior to you, and all these different stuff. Not all foreigners who are practicing foreigners foreign from Iceland. Not all foreigners are practicing Alsatru or their version of it, Odinism or whatever, in a negative aspect. But because of the negative connotations, they've separated themselves. So if you want to be part of the Icelandic revival movement, you have to be in Iceland and a resident there, which is actually kind of cool, and I respect that to a degree. But again, have inspiration from it. Alsatru, the Aus is the old gods, and through, or faith in the old gods. That's what it essentially translates to, as faith in the old gods. But they acknowledge as a revival movement. That was not the name or word that they used in the olden times. And because the cultures and societies adapted new things, they lost a lot of their old traditions. In fact, most of what we know of the past, and this is going to apply to Druidry as well, with Alsatru, is the old sagas and eddas of Iceland. Snorri Snorrisson, I believe was his name, was one of the more famous ones that wrote down some of these poems. So they take these stories and they interpret from it. So there's the question then, well, how do you know how much of these stories were true and just made up stuff? Well, let's refer back again to Christianity. You have the Bible. Really? I mean, the entire world was flooded and everyone was killed, so I guess we're all incestuous inbreds then, because everyone but one family that got on the ark survived? I mean, you see what I'm saying? It's like, they literally, if you're going to argue, and you happen to be Christian, which you might not be, you happen to be Christian, let's say, and you're going to argue the validity of Alsatru or Druidry or something like that because they're basing some of their practices and faiths off of stories. That's literally the basis for one of the biggest religions in the world. It is based off of these fictional stories that were written down for whatever reason to learn lessons from. And sure, you can learn lessons from the Bible, that's fine. You also learn lessons from these accounts and these eddas and sagas. And again, we don't know how much of it's true. We don't, because a lot of it had been lost. But here's the other thing that's interesting. The way that different Nordic traditions, as they've become Christian, how they differ from how the United States does Christianity. Or if you take over into like Japan and stuff, where Shinto is one of their main religions, as well as Buddhism, Zen Buddhism specifically. Buddhism actually has Buddhism, Zen Buddhism, Chan Buddhism, big vehicle Buddhism, small vehicle Buddhism. There's, again, many different interpretations and different practices based upon the region and culture. So I wonder how much of an influence the Icelandic traditions had on that. Not to mention you have the same thing with Druidry when you talk about some of the practices and stuff and the similarities that Christians do. So if you go to like Ireland or Wales or England and stuff, some of the ways that they practice some of their Christianity is very similar to some of the historical Druid stuff that we do have, which is very little. So Alsatru, as I'd mentioned, is this revival movement in Iceland that is based upon trying to reclaim their history. So you have cultural traditions, things that people did as part of their lives that are not going to die, just like you see different stuff like Yule or Yule or winter solstice or Albanarthen, depending on what name you want to give it, in the winter, which happens to, interestingly enough, if you look at the Orthodox faith, Christmas was actually January, July, or somewhere in that area. It was in the spring. It wasn't in the winter, but they do Christmas in the winter near this winter solstice. By the way, this, interestingly enough, this Yule, Albanarthen, actually is even practiced in China. Dongzi is essentially the same winter solstice celebration. So it's interesting. It's a cultural thing across different cultures But again, you see influences. So what does a tree have to do with the birth of Christ? Nothing. What is Santa Claus and presents and all this? Nothing. Because feasting and trees, evergreen trees that live throughout the winter, it's still life, even though everything else seems dead. Lighting the Yule log because, burning this flame because summer and heat's going to come back. These polytheistic interpretations are still practiced within the monotheistic Christian faiths and mythologies, still interpret the same ones from the old times because it's part of our culture. So again, even though we've lost most of it, I wonder how much of it is still alive today. When you talk about stuff, like I said, in Iceland, the fact that some of the citizens will actually acknowledge that they still believe in elves and fairies and stuff, that some do. It's also interesting in Iceland because apparently most Icelanders, maybe half roughly, don't associate with any religion. And apparently the big church of Iceland is Lutheranism. So they have the Lutheran church there. But some of them are Ásatrúars, or part of this revival movement, which again, they acknowledge as a revival movement because they're trying to tap into what their ancestors used to do, get reconnected with the earth. Druidry is in a very similar state. So let's talk about my video series, Walking the Druid Path. So as I've been inspired and called by these different traditions to research and study and interpret it in my own way from my own path, obviously I've come across Ásatrú, I've come across Druidry, I've come across Taoism, I've come across all these different practices and faiths. It doesn't really matter what they all are, but with different books and stuff and plenty of things that I've read and looked through, like actually right there on that shelf, those two shelves there, you have a lot of it. You got Druids, Druid Magic, Ásatrú, Essential Ásatrú, Healer's Manual, Earth Power, Earth, Wind, Air, Fire, and Water, Grimoire of Shadows, Italian Witchcraft, or the Strega. You talk about elemental rituals, Hands of Light, Tao of Jeet Kune Do randomly thrown in there, Green Magic. Like, you have all this different stuff. Witchcraft, vampires, nocturnal witchcraft, herbalism, crystals, Dancing with Dragons, tons and tons and tons of stuff because it's all over there and there's wisdom everywhere to learn from and interpret from. And specifically with Druidry, the Walking the Druid Path is based upon Obod, Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, which is that big, large brown section right here. These brown folders is the Bardic grade, which I've had for, I guess, 5 years, 6 years now. And I've skimmed through some of it, went through some of it in more detail, and that's what I'm kind of sharing as my journey through researching through that because, I like reading that stuff. It's kind of cool. I think it's neat and inspiring. Well, the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, which, again, I'm part of the Bardic class. I've not finished it officially. I've not officially become a bard with them. I'm just part of the Bardic class. It's about they take the time to acknowledge that they're not the ancient Druids. They don't claim to be the Druids of the olden times. They are a new revival movement. And guess what? There are Druid Christians among the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids that are embraced and accepted as brothers and sisters. They're not rejected. You can literally mix it with anything. Interestingly enough, that Philip Cargam, who is the essentially Archdruid, the head Druid for Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, has said in his first couple of Gwersu, or Gwers, which is Welsh for a lesson, or apparently it means like a ray of light, but it's this lesson that he says if it doesn't make sense, you just toss it to the side. You embrace and you adapt what makes sense out of you, because that's what they're trying to do, is inspire people to find their own path and to connect and to become one with existence in any way that makes sense to them. And he seems to present it as a spirituality as well as a religion. So you can do either. Now, if you look at someone like the ADF, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce it, but a Druid Fellowship, but there's actually, might be Irish, might be Welsh, I'm not sure what the language is, but it's like, I butcher it every time I try to say it. In America, there's ADF, and they are a Druid group, but it is a religion. It's not a spirituality. You become a Druid. You're a Druid or you're not a Druid. One of the Taoist guys that I spoke with, trying to find more about Taoism, if I wanted to study or learn from him, I had to fully devote myself to Taoism and drop everything else I was doing. Obod, on the other hand, which is why I like it personally, is all about adapting it into your own personal path and growing your path with it. That type of stuff is cool to me, makes sense. But guess what else Obad does, besides for the fact that they mention adapt what makes sense to you? They acknowledge the fact that they're not the ancient druids. They tell you how long this has been going on for. It's only got about a 300-year history. 300 years is a respectable history, in my opinion. So it's a more modern path, but it's still got some ancientness to it. But why? Why are we as people drawn to these ancient paths? How long people have been doing stuff for doesn't make it more valid or more meaningful. Who are the first people that came up and invented these religions and spiritualities and these paths? What made people 2,000-3,000 years ago more intelligent than people of today? I'm not saying we're more intelligent now. Now we are exposed to more, and we have internet and books that have been written by people of the past. So we have more today to compare against, and we have more theories and dogmas and stigmas which have been dissipated with knowledge, understanding, or research. So what you choose to buy into is your choice. But again, just because a path is not thousands of years old doesn't make it less valid. What makes Alsatru or any of the modern paths, Druidry or Wicca or any of them, valid is because people today are following them and finding them and seeking the answers out for themselves. To me, that's what makes them valid. That's what makes Christianity and Hinduism valid. Not because it's thousands of years old, because people are following it today, making it part of their life, inspiring how they interact with others, and embrace their own destiny in this lifetime. They're getting out of it what they need to get out of it. And to me, that's what makes a path valid. So yeah, again, going back to this comment, yeah, it's modern. That's fine. I don't have a problem with that. 300 years doesn't even matter if it was 50 years. Like I said, supposedly with Wicca, roughly 50 years, depending on who you talk to. But regardless, if Wicca's 50 years or 1,000 years, again, for a Wiccan, which I am not, but for a Wiccan, more power to them. If it makes sense for them and they're getting what they want out of it, why does it matter? Why are people so concerned with dictating to others what path is right? Where is your evidence of any of it? Where is your evidence of your God, goddess, deity, spirituality, great spirit path? Whether it is atheism or Scientology or some sort of religion or just spirituality, there's no 100% hardcore evidence. Even the evidence that we technically provide, scientifically speaking, is up to interpretation as well, because supposedly, scientifically speaking, the world was flat at one time. There was science that validated that. It's like a fact is only a fact until it's proven wrong. So we have been wrong in our theories and hypotheses before, and we've believed them until we had enough evidence to prove otherwise. I believe at one time it was a scientific fact that flies came from garbage. Garbage turned into flies. Until one person realized it was the maggots, the baby flies, and they tried to cover it up, and no flies formed. Well, you need air for garbage to become flies. So they put a screen. No flies, no maggots. Nothing came out of it. So it was the flies laying, or maybe the garbage becomes maggots or turns into maggots, or so. I don't remember the exact thing. You can look it up. It's out there. But again, facts are only facts until proven otherwise. People have theories all the time. And religion and spirituality is not about